Inflation is destroying America. That's what they're telling you now. Republicans have made it their number one issue, their rallying cry, their proof that Democrats can't manage the economy. Except here's the thing. They didn't care about inflation when it was happening under their guy. Not even a little bit. So let's talk about that, because this isn't new. This is the playbook. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's start with some basic facts. In 2018, inflation ticked up to 2.4%. Not a crisis, but noticeable. Republicans controlled the White House, the Senate, and until midterms, the House. Their response? Silence. Actually, not silence, celebration. They were too busy praising their tax cuts and talking about the greatest economy ever to worry about rising prices. Fast forward to 2020, inflation hits 2.6%. Democrats are barely in office, and suddenly it's a national emergency. Fox News runs inflation segments daily. Republican lawmakers hold press conferences. Social media explodes with outrage. 2.6% is now a catastrophe. Wait, what? 2.4 under Trump was fine. 2.6 under Biden is a disaster. Let's do that math again. 0.2% difference. That's the margin of crisis, apparently, but it gets better. By mid-2021, inflation is at 5%. Republicans are calling it the worst economic crisis in generations. Fair enough, 5% is high. Except in 2008, under a Republican president, inflation hit 5.6%. And back then, crickets from the GOP. No emergency press conferences, no demands for resignations, just business as usual. So what changed? Not the inflation rate, the party in power. Here's where it gets really interesting. Republicans love to show you charts. They'll pull up a graph showing inflation spiking from 1.4% in early 2021 to 9.1% by mid-2022. And they'll say, look, Biden did this. Okay, let's look at that chart. It starts in January 2021, right when Biden takes office. How convenient. But what if we start that same chart in 2019? Suddenly you see inflation was already rising in 2020, under Trump. In fact, inflation started accelerating in mid-2020, a full 6 months before Biden even took office. But they don't show you that chart, because that chart doesn't fit the narrative. And here's the thing about narratives. They rely on where you start counting. If you start counting in 2021, Biden owns all of it. If you start counting in 2019, Trump owns the beginning of it. Same data, different story. And Republicans are very, very good at picking which story to tell. Let's talk about another favorite tactic, the selective statistic. Republicans love to say, inflation is up 120% since Biden took office. That sounds insane, right? 120% increase. Except that's not what inflation means. Inflation isn't up 120%. The rate of inflation increased. Prices are up by the cumulative inflation over that period, which is closer to 18 to 20% depending on the category. Still bad, still hurts families. But not 120% bad. But they say it anyway because it sounds worse. And most people don't know the difference between the rate of inflation and cumulative price increases. So the talking point spreads, and it works. Now let's talk about solutions, because Republicans aren't just complaining about inflation, they're promising to fix it. Their solution, the same solution they always have, tax cuts. Specifically, tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy. Here's the problem with that. Tax cuts increase demand, more money in circulation, more spending, more demand, more upward pressure on prices. That's inflation, the thing they're supposedly fighting. But this isn't about solutions, it's about messaging, because they know that most people don't follow the economic theory. They hear tax cuts and think more money for me. Even though corporate tax cuts don't trickle down, they never have. But that doesn't stop Republicans from promising them. And the media amplifies all of it, because inflation stories get clicks, inflation stories get views, inflation stories make people angry, and angry people engage with content. So you get endless coverage of gas prices, grocery prices, rent increases, all real problems, all legitimately affecting families. But the coverage rarely includes context. It rarely mentions that inflation is global, that Europe is dealing with it, that Japan is dealing with it, that it's driven by supply chain disruptions from a pandemic and a war in Ukraine, not by one president's policies. No, the story is simpler. Prices are high, Democrats are in charge, therefore Democrats caused it. That's the narrative. And Republicans are more than happy to ride that narrative all the way to November. But let's go back to 2018 for a second. Remember when inflation was rising under Trump? Republicans weren't just silent, they were actively dismissive. When Democrats raised concerns about rising costs, Republicans called them alarmist. When economic analysts warned about potential inflationary pressure from massive deficit spending, Republicans ignored them. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act added nearly $2 trillion to the deficit. $2 trillion. That's money pumped into an already hot economy. And what happens when you pump money into a hot economy? Demand increases, prices rise, inflation. But back then, Republicans told you not to worry about it. Deficits don't matter, they said. Growth will pay for it, they said. And when inflation started ticking up in 2018, just temporary fluctuations. Nothing to see here. Now, deficits are a crisis. Inflation is a crisis. Government spending is out of control. And it's all the Democrats' fault. Same playbook, different year. Let's talk about gas prices, because that's the favorite example. Gas hit $4 a gallon in some areas. Republicans lost their minds. Biden did this. Biden's energy policies. Biden's regulations. Biden. Okay, let's check something. In 2008, gas hit $4.08 per gallon, national average, under George W. Bush, Republican president. And what did Republicans say back then? That the president doesn't control gas prices, that global markets determine fuel costs, that supply and demand are complex. All true, by the way. The president really doesn't control gas prices, but apparently that's only true when a Republican is president. When a Democrat is president, suddenly it's all his fault. There are even stickers at gas pumps now, with Biden pointing at the price, saying I did that, as if the President of the United States personally sets fuel costs at every station in America. It would be funny if it wasn't so effective. Here's another favorite move, the anecdote. Republicans love to find someone, usually at a grocery store, and ask them how they're doing. And the person says, terrible. Everything's so expensive. I can barely afford groceries. Real problem. Real pain. But then they blame the current administration without mentioning that wages have also increased, that unemployment is at historic lows, that job growth has been strong. Not because those things solve inflation, they don't, but because they're part of the full economic picture. But you don't get the full picture. You get the sad grocery shopper, because that's the story that works. And don't get me wrong, high prices are a problem. Families are struggling. That's real. But the outrage isn't about helping those families. If it were, Republicans would be supporting things like expanded child tax credits, or increased minimum wage, or affordable housing initiatives, policies that actually put money in working people's pockets. But they don't support those things. They oppose them. Because this isn't about fixing inflation. It's about using inflation. Let's look at the pattern. Because this isn't new. In 2010, Republicans made the deficit their central issue. Remember? The Tea Party rose up. Spending is out of control. We're bankrupting our children. Fiscal responsibility. All of that. Then Trump took office. And in 4 years, he added nearly $8 trillion to the national debt. More than any president in history. And Republicans? Silent. Actually celebrating. Because it was their guy. Now Biden's in office, and suddenly the deficit matters again. Spending is out of control again. We're bankrupting our children again. See the pattern? Or take healthcare. In 2010, Republicans said Obamacare would destroy the economy. Millions would lose their jobs. Healthcare costs would skyrocket. It would be a disaster. None of that happened. Millions gained coverage. Pre-existing conditions became protected. Healthcare costs rose, but at slower rates than projected without the law. But did Republicans admit they were wrong? No. They just moved on to the next crisis, which was deficits again, then immigration, then critical race theory, then inflation. Always a crisis, always an emergency, always the Democrats' fault, never with solutions, never with acknowledgement when the predictions don't come true. Just on to the next thing. And inflation is perfect for this strategy because everyone experiences it. You see it at the grocery store, at the gas pump, on your rent statement. It's visceral, it's immediate, and it's easy to blame whoever's in charge, which is why Republicans are leaning into it so hard, because they don't have to explain complicated policy. They don't have to defend their own record. They just have to point at a price tag and say, look how high that is. Democrats did that. Even though inflation is happening globally, even though it started under the previous administration, even though the causes are complex and multifaceted, none of that matters, because the message is simple, and simple messages win. So here we are. Republicans are running on inflation. They're making it their closing argument. Prices are high. Democrats are bad. Vote for us. And if they win, if they take back Congress or the White House, what's their plan? Tax cuts, deregulation, the same policies that contributed to inflation in the first place, but by then it won't matter, because they'll be in charge. And suddenly inflation won't be a crisis anymore. It'll be a complex issue requiring patience and careful management, just like it was in 2018. The outrage will disappear. The press conferences will stop. The charts will change. And if prices are still high, they'll blame Democrats for the mess they left behind, even though they'll have been in power for months or years. Because that's how this works. That's how it's always worked. The crisis only exists when it's useful. The outrage only appears when it's convenient. And the solutions only matter when they help the right people. Everyone else, you're just supposed to believe the latest version of the story, whichever version benefits them at that moment. So the next time you hear a Republican raging about inflation, ask yourself, where were they in 2018? Where were they in 2008? What were they saying then? And when you realize they weren't saying anything, when you see that the outrage only appeared when a Democrat took office, you'll understand exactly what this is. It's not about inflation. It's never about inflation. It's about power. And they'll say whatever they need to say to get it.